July 27, 2002. Sknyliv Airfield, Lviv, Ukraine. A perfect summer day. Clear blue skies. Thousands of families gathered on the grass near the runway, enjoying picnics, watching what was supposed to be a celebration. Children waved Ukrainian flags. Parents held up cameras. The Ukrainian Air Force was celebrating its 10th anniversary with a spectacular air show, and everyone was excited to see the jets perform. Among the crowd were families who had traveled from across western Ukraine, young couples with babies in strollers, teenagers filming on early digital cameras, elderly veterans who remembered the Soviet days. They spread blankets on the grass, opened coolers of food and drinks, and settled in for what they thought would be a thrilling but safe afternoon of entertainment. The star of the show was the Sukhoi Su-27 flanker, one of the most advanced fighter jets ever built by the Soviet Union. This wasn't some vintage propeller plane doing loops. This was a twin-engine supersonic air superiority fighter. 30 tons of raw power, 48-foot wingspan, capable of speeds exceeding 1,500 miles per hour. A machine designed for one purpose: to dominate the skies in combat. But on this day the Su-27 wasn't being used for combat. It was being used for entertainment, and the two pilots inside had something to prove. At the controls was Colonel Vladimir Toponar, an experienced Ukrainian Air Force pilot with hundreds of hours of flight time. In the rear seat was his co-pilot, Major Yuri Yegorov. Both men were professionals. Both had performed airshow demonstrations before. Both knew the risks of low-altitude aerobatics, and both were about to make a decision that would kill 85 people. The plan was simple, or so it seemed. They would perform a barrel roll, one of the most visually spectacular maneuvers in aviation. The massive fighter jet would roll completely around its longitudinal axis while flying forward, creating a corkscrew path through the air. Done correctly at proper altitude, it's breathtaking. Done incorrectly at low altitude, it's suicide. Standard procedure for airshow barrel rolls called for a minimum altitude of 500 feet, roughly the height of a 50-story building. This gives the pilot adequate margin for error, time to recover if something goes wrong, and ensures that even if the aircraft descends during the maneuver, there's still clearance between the plane and the ground. But 500 feet wasn't spectacular enough. It wasn't close enough. It wouldn't wow the crowd the way Toponar and Yegorov wanted. Previous Ukrainian air shows had been criticized in military circles as boring and too safe. Other countries, Russia, the United States, European nations, were pushing boundaries with increasingly daring displays. Ukraine's Air Force wanted to prove they could compete. They wanted to show that Ukrainian pilots were just as skilled, just as brave, just as willing to take risks. So Toponar and Yegorov decided to perform their barrel roll at approximately 30 to 50 feet above the ground. Let that sink in. 30 to 50 feet. That's the height of a 3-story building. The Su-27's wingspan alone was 48 feet. This meant that during the roll, each wing would pass within mere feet, possibly even inches of the ground. There would be virtually no margin for error. A slight miscalculation of altitude, a gust of wind, a moment of disorientation, even a bird strike, any of these could send 30 tons of fighter jets slamming into the earth at 250 miles per hour. Fellow pilots had warned them. When Toponar discussed the maneuver during planning sessions, other Ukrainian Air Force pilots told him it was too dangerous. Impossible at that altitude, one said. Suicidal, said another. The physics simply didn't allow for safe execution. At such low altitude, if anything went wrong, there would be no time to recover, no time to eject, no time to save the aircraft or themselves. But Toponar dismissed the warnings. He was confident, he was experienced. He had practiced low-altitude maneuvers before. He believed he could pull it off. And perhaps more importantly, he felt pressure from his commanders, from his fellow pilots, from the entire Ukrainian military establishment, to deliver a show that would be remembered. To prove that Ukraine's Air Force was world-class. What he didn't fully consider was the crowd. The thousands of spectators sitting on the grass near the runway. Standard safety protocols at air shows around the world require spectator areas to be positioned at least 500 meters, roughly a quarter mile away from the flight line. This distance ensures that even in the event of a crash, the aircraft is unlikely to reach the crowd before coming to a stop. But at Sknyliv, safety protocols were ignored. The crowd was positioned far too close to the runway. Some spectators were less than 100 meters away. Children were playing in areas that should have been restricted. There were no physical barriers, no fences, no walls, nothing to separate the audience from the active flight zone. If something went wrong, the crowd would be directly in the path of a crashing aircraft. At approximately 12:52 p.m. local time, the Su-27 took off. The roar of its twin AL-31F turbofan engines shook the ground. Each engine produced over 27,000 pounds of thrust. The noise was deafening, thrilling. The crowd cheered as the massive fighter jet climbed into the clear blue sky, banking gracefully to the left, beginning its display routine. For the first several minutes, everything went according to plan. Toponar and Yegorov performed several maneuvers, tight turns, high-speed passes, vertical climbs. The crowd watched in awe. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view. Cameras clicked and whirred. This was what they had come to see. Then came the moment that would change everything. The Su-27 leveled off and began its approach for the barrel roll. Toponar reduced altitude, descending lower and lower. The jet screamed over the runway at tremendous speed, barely above the tree line. Spectators who understood aviation began to feel uneasy. "He's too low," someone muttered. "That's not safe." But most of the crowd simply watched in amazement. They assumed the pilots knew what they were doing. They assumed this was all part of the show, carefully calculated and rehearsed. They had no idea they were about to witness the deadliest airshow disaster in history. Vladimir Toponar was 43 years old on the day of the disaster. He had joined the Soviet Air Force in the early 1980s during the Cold War, when being a fighter pilot meant being part of an elite warrior class. He had trained on Mi fighters before transitioning to the Su-27 after Ukrainian independence in 1991. By 2002, he had accumulated over 1,000 flight hours and held the rank of colonel. On paper, he was one of Ukraine's most qualified pilots. But experience alone doesn't guarantee good judgment. And in the weeks leading up to the Sknyliv Air Show, Toponar was under immense pressure. The Ukrainian Air Force in 2002 was struggling. The country had inherited a massive Soviet military infrastructure after independence, but the post-Soviet economic collapse meant there was little money to maintain it. Aircraft were aging. Training was limited. Morale was low. Many skilled pilots had left for civilian aviation or emigrated to other countries seeking better opportunities. Ukrainian military leadership saw the 10th anniversary air show as an opportunity to restore pride and demonstrate capability. They wanted a show that would impress not just Ukrainian citizens but also foreign observers and potential military partners. There were rumors that NATO officials might attend, defense contractors would be watching. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a demonstration of Ukraine's military readiness. Toponar felt the weight of these expectations. In planning meetings, commanders had made it clear they wanted something spectacular and unforgettable. When Toponar proposed the low-altitude barrel roll, there was initial hesitation from some officials, but ultimately he received approval, or at the very least no one explicitly stopped him. This is a critical point in understanding how the disaster occurred. Air show safety depends on multiple layers of oversight. Pilots shouldn't make dangerous decisions alone. There should be safety officers, technical experts and commanders who review every maneuver and enforce strict altitude minimums. But at Sknyliv these safeguards either didn't exist or were ignored. Yuri Yegorov, the 36-year-old co-pilot, also bore responsibility. In a two-seat fighter jet, the rear seat pilot serves as both a second pair of eyes and a check on the primary pilot's decisions. If Yegorov had serious concerns about the maneuver, he could have and should have voiced them. But whether out of deference to his more senior colleague, confidence in Toponar's skill, or his own desire to be part of a spectacular display, Yegorov went along with the plan. The day before the show, during final rehearsals, the two pilots practiced the barrel roll at slightly higher altitude, around 150 feet. Even at that height, it was risky. One observer later recalled feeling sick to his stomach watching the practice run. But the pilots completed it successfully, and this may have given them false confidence that they could go even lower during the actual show. There's also evidence of a toxic show-off culture in military aviation circles. Pilots compete with each other to see who can perform the most daring stunts. There's often an unspoken belief that expressing safety concerns makes you look weak or timid. Real pilots, according to this mindset, push boundaries. They take calculated risks. They trust their skills. But calculated risks implies proper calculation, understanding the physics, the aircraft limits, the environmental factors, the consequences of failure. And in this case, the calculation was fatally flawed. On the morning of July 27, Toponar and Yegorov climbed into their Su-27 feeling confident. They had their plan. They had approval, tacit if not explicit. They had an audience waiting to be amazed. What they didn't have was an appreciation for how thin the margin between success and catastrophe truly was. At 12:52 p.m., the Su-27 began its final approach. The fighter jet came in low and fast over the tree line at the end of the runway, engines screaming. From the ground, spectators could see every detail of the aircraft: the blue camouflage paint scheme, the red star markings, the massive air intakes feeding the twin engines. Toponar was flying at approximately 250 miles per hour. At that speed, the aircraft covered about 367 feet per second, more than the length of a football field every single second. This gave him almost no time to react if anything went wrong. As the Su-27 passed over the runway, Toponar initiated the barrel roll. He pulled back on the stick and applied lateral pressure, causing the massive fighter to begin rotating around its longitudinal axis. The nose lifted slightly, the wings tilted. The aircraft began its corkscrew motion. For a brief moment, it looked spectacular. The crowd gasped and cheered. This was exactly what they had come to see: the raw power and agility of a modern fighter jet on full display, close enough to feel the thunder of its engines and see the pilot inside the canopy. But something was wrong. Toponar had misjudged his altitude. Or perhaps a downdraft pushed the aircraft lower than expected. Or maybe the physics of the maneuver simply required more vertical space than he had calculated. Whatever the reason, as the Su-27 rolled inverted upside down, it descended. The crowd's cheers turned to confused murmurs. Even those with no aviation knowledge could sense something wasn't right. The jet was too close to the ground, much too close. At the far end of the runway stood a line of trees, old-growth pines and oaks that had been there for decades. As the inverted Su-27 continued its roll, the left wing dipped lower and lower. Spectators watched in disbelief as the wing tip, moving at 250 miles per hour, approached the tree line. Then it happened. The wing struck a tree branch. The impact was catastrophic. A Su-27's wing isn't just a thin piece of metal, it's a complex structure containing fuel tanks, control surfaces, and structural spars designed to withstand enormous aerodynamic loads. But it's not designed to hit a solid object at 250 miles per hour. The collision tore through the wing's leading edge, ripping metal and composite materials. Fuel from the ruptured wing tanks began streaming into the air. Worst of all, the impact created massive asymmetric forces on the aircraft. Suddenly, one wing had significantly more drag than the other. The aircraft yawed violently to the left. Inside the cockpit, Toponar and Yegorov were thrown against their harnesses. Warning alarms screamed. The stick shook violently in Toponar's hands. He tried to level the wings, to pull up, to do something, anything, to regain control. But physics doesn't negotiate. At 30 feet of altitude traveling at 250 miles per hour, there was no time and no space to recover. The Su-27 was no longer flying, it was falling with forward momentum, a 30-ton projectile following a ballistic trajectory. This is when the cockpit voice recorder captured Toponar's horrified realization. Where are the spectators? 3 words that would haunt investigators, survivors, and the families of the victims forever. 3 words that revealed Toponar had somehow lost situational awareness. How could a pilot performing at an air show not know where the spectators were? They were exactly where they should be at an air show, watching. But they were also exactly where they shouldn't be. Far too close to the runway, directly in the aircraft's path. Yegorov screamed something unintelligible. Toponar pulled the ejection handle. But it was too late. 3 seconds after the tree strike, the Su-27 hit the ground. The impact occurred at the edge of the crowd. The aircraft's nose struck first, plowing into the earth at a shallow angle. The forward fuselage crumpled instantly. Then the main body of the jet, still carrying tremendous forward momentum, skidded across the grass, directly into the spectator area. Bodies were torn apart instantly. Some victims were struck by the aircraft itself, 30 tons of metal and fuel moving at highway speeds. Others were caught in the jet's intake, sucked into the engines that were still running. Still others were crushed beneath the wreckage as the fuselage tumbled and slid. But the impact was only the beginning of the horror. Su-27 fighters carry several tons of jet fuel, essentially kerosene. When the aircraft struck the ground, its fuel tanks ruptured. Thousands of gallons of highly flammable liquid sprayed across the crash site, soaking the wreckage and surrounding ground. Sparks from metal scraping against metal, or possibly electrical shorts from damaged systems, provided ignition. The fireball was massive and instantaneous. A wall of orange flame erupted from the crash site, expanding outward at terrifying speed. The heat was so intense that it could be felt from hundreds of meters away. Metal components melted, the grass incinerated, and anyone within the immediate vicinity, spectators who had survived the initial impact, were engulfed in flames. Survivors later described a sound like thunder, followed immediately by screaming. People on fire ran in all directions, desperately trying to extinguish flames that had soaked their clothes with jet fuel. Parents frantically searched for children who had been standing beside them seconds earlier. The smell of burning jet fuel mixed with something far worse, burning human flesh. The crash site became a scene of absolute chaos and horror. Black smoke billowed into the clear blue sky, visible for miles. People stampeded away from the flames, trampling over picnic blankets and abandoned belongings. Those who had been sitting farther back stood frozen in shock, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Emergency personnel rushed toward the crash, but there was little they could do in the first critical minutes. The fire was too intense to approach. Fire trucks arrived but struggled to contain the flames because jet fuel burns at extremely high temperatures and spreads rapidly. By the time firefighters were able to get close to the wreckage, most of those caught in the immediate impact zone were already dead. Paramedics and volunteers began triaging survivors at a makeshift medical area set up on the far side of the airfield. The injuries were catastrophic, severe burns covering entire bodies, traumatic amputations from being struck by debris, crush injuries from being caught under the wreckage, head trauma from being thrown by the blast wave. The local hospitals were overwhelmed within an hour. Lviv had never experienced anything like this. Ambulances formed long lines outside emergency rooms. Doctors and nurses worked frantically to save those who could be saved, but many victims were beyond help. The burns were too severe, the internal injuries too extensive, and at the center of it all, the twisted burning wreckage of the Su-27 sent black smoke into the sky like a funeral pyre. Both pilots survived. Toponar and Yegorov had ejected a fraction of a second before impact. Their ejection seats, designed specifically to save pilots in catastrophic situations, had functioned perfectly. They were thrown clear of the aircraft, their parachutes deployed, and they landed roughly but alive in a field several hundred meters away. They survived while 85 of the people who came to watch them perform died. The official death toll was 85. But behind that number were 85 individual human beings, 85 people with names, families, dreams, and futures that ended in a fireball on a summer afternoon. 28 of the dead were children. Let that number sink in. 28 children. Kids who had begged their parents to take them to the air show, who had been excited for days about seeing the jets, who had waved flags and held toy airplanes and dreamed of maybe one day becoming pilots themselves. 28 children who never made it home. Among the dead was a young mother who had thrown herself over her infant daughter when she saw the jet coming. Investigators found them together in the wreckage. The mother's body was burned beyond recognition, but her daughter, shielded beneath her, survived with severe injuries. The baby would grow up never knowing her mother, but alive because of a mother's final desperate act of love. There was an elderly couple, both World War II veterans, who had come to the show because they remembered when air shows were rare treats during Soviet times. They were sitting together on a blanket, holding hands when the jet hit. They died instantly, together. Their family later said it was somehow fitting that they went together, though that did little to ease the grief. A teenage boy who had saved money from his summer job to buy a camera specifically to photograph the jets. He was filming when the accident occurred. His camera, recovered from the wreckage, still contained the final seconds of footage, his last moments alive, captured on film. 3 generations of one family, a grandmother, her daughter and 2 grandchildren, all killed. The father of the family had stayed home to work. He lost his entire family in seconds. The injuries among the 543 survivors were equally horrific. Dozens suffered burns over 50% or more of their bodies. These burns weren't simple first-degree burns, they were third-degree burns caused by jet fuel fires that exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Skin melted. Muscle tissue was destroyed. Many survivors would require years of painful surgeries and skin grafts. Others lost limbs. Arms and legs sheared off by flying debris or crushed beneath the wreckage. Young people who would spend the rest of their lives learning to walk with prosthetics or live without the full use of their bodies. And beyond the physical injuries, there was psychological trauma. Thousands of people witnessed the crash. Many saw friends and family members die in front of them. Children watched their parents burn. Parents watched their children crushed. These images don't fade, they don't disappear with time. Decades later, survivors still have nightmares. Still flinch at the sound of jet engines, still smell burning fuel in their memory. In the days following the disaster, Lviv became a city in mourning. Black ribbons appeared everywhere, on buildings, on trees, on lampposts. Memorial services were held. The local cathedral was filled beyond capacity with families weeping for their loved ones. Ukrainian President Leonid Kuchma visited the crash site and promised a full investigation, but his words rang hollow to those who had lost everything. The identification process was agonizing. Many bodies were burned so severely that visual identification was impossible. Dental records and DNA testing were required. Some families waited weeks to learn whether their loved ones had died. And in a few heartbreaking cases, remains were so damaged they could never be definitively identified. The funerals stretched over days. Coffins, many of them heartbreakingly small, were buried in cemeteries across Lviv. Some families held empty casket ceremonies because there were no remains to bury. The grief was compounded by anger. These deaths weren't from a natural disaster or an enemy attack, they were preventable. They were the result of human arrogance, poor judgment and negligent safety practices. One mother who lost her 7-year-old son told reporters, "We came to see the jets, not to die. They killed my boy. They killed him with their stupid tricks." The investigation moved with remarkable speed, driven by intense public outrage and political pressure from the highest levels of Ukrainian government. Within just days of the disaster, Ukrainian authorities had recovered the cockpit voice recorder from the burned wreckage. It had survived the crash and fire exactly as designed, preserving the final critical minutes of audio from inside the cockpit. They analyzed every piece of wreckage systematically, conducted detailed metallurgical studies on the failed wing section, interviewed dozens of surviving witnesses, and reconstructed the flight path using radar data and video footage captured by spectators. The conclusion was undeniable and damning: pilot error, compounded by catastrophically inadequate safety measures. Both Vladimir Toponar and Yuri Yegorov were arrested within 48 hours and charged with violating air safety regulations and 85 counts of involuntary manslaughter. 2 air show organizers were also arrested: Colonel Volodymyr Toponenko, a military commander who had approved the flight plan, and Viktor Balaka, a civilian safety coordinator responsible for enforcing safety protocols. Both were charged with criminal negligence for allowing spectators to be positioned dangerously close to the active flight zone. The trial began in December 2002, just 5 months after the disaster. The courtroom in Lviv was packed to absolute capacity every single day with victims' families, many wearing black mourning clothes and carrying framed photographs of their dead loved ones, heartbreaking images of smiling children who would never grow up, of parents who would never see another birthday, of grandparents who died holding hands. The atmosphere was intensely emotional and often explosive. Several family members had to be physically escorted from the courtroom after screaming at the defendants, calling them murderers and child killers, demanding to know why they were allowed to live when 85 others had died in flames. Toponar and Yegorov's defense attorneys mounted an aggressive defense, arguing that the pilots had been following orders from superior officers, that they had received at least tacit approval for the maneuver, and that the primary legal and moral blame should lie with those who had allowed spectators to be positioned so close to the runway in clear violation of international safety standards. There was actually significant validity to these arguments. The safety failures at Sknyliv were indeed systemic and organizational, extending far beyond just two pilots making a bad decision, but the prosecution, led by experienced Ukrainian prosecutors, focused relentlessly on one indisputable fact: Toponar, as pilot in command with over 1,000 hours of experience and the rank of colonel, had personally chosen to fly at a dangerously low altitude, despite explicit warnings from fellow pilots who had told him the maneuver was impossible and suicidal at that height. He was a senior officer. He knew the risks intimately. He understood physics and aerodynamics. He had clear alternatives available. He could have performed the barrel roll at a safe altitude of 500 feet, where it would still have been impressive but survivable if something went wrong, or he could have refused to perform the maneuver entirely and chosen something safer. Instead, he chose to prioritize spectacle over safety, reputation over caution, and 85 innocent people died as a direct and foreseeable result of that choice. The trial heard devastating testimony. Survivors described watching their children burn. Aviation experts explained in technical detail why the maneuver was physically impossible at that altitude. The courtroom heard the cockpit voice recording, including Toponar's horrified final words, "Where are the spectators?" When that recording played, the courtroom fell into absolute silence except for the sounds of family members sobbing. Some sat stone-faced, hands clenched white with fury, staring at the defendants with expressions of pure hatred. After weeks of testimony and several days of jury deliberation, the verdict came down in February 2003, guilty on all counts. Toponar and Yegorov were each sentenced to 14 years in prison, one of the harshest sentences ever given for an aviation accident in Ukrainian history. The two organizers received shorter sentences reflecting their lesser but still significant culpability. Colonel Toponenko received 8 years and civilian coordinator Balaka received 6 years. The sentences immediately sparked intense controversy and public debate across Ukraine. Many people, especially victims' families, believed the sentences were far too lenient. How could the deaths of 85 people, including 28 innocent children, result in only 14 years? If you calculate it coldly, that's less than 2 months per victim. Some families demanded life sentences, arguing that the pilots had essentially committed mass murder through criminal negligence. Others argued that the pilots were being made scapegoats for much deeper systemic failures that should have implicated higher-ranking officials, the generals who had fostered the dangerous risk-taking culture in Ukrainian military aviation, the politicians who had slashed military budgets to the point where proper safety oversight became impossible, the bureaucrats who had approved the air show without ensuring adequate safety measures were in place. Both pilots served their sentences in harsh Ukrainian prisons, institutions where conditions were far from comfortable, where former military officers were not treated with any special consideration or respect. Toponar was released in 2016 after serving his full 14-year term without parole. Yegorov was released slightly earlier, around 2014 on parole for good behavior. Both men have lived in complete obscurity since their release, their careers destroyed, their reputations shattered forever, their names forever synonymous with Ukraine's worst airshow disaster. Neither has ever given a public interview. Neither has ever spoken publicly about what happened that day or what they were thinking. After release from prison, both men simply disappeared into anonymity somewhere in Ukraine. In the years since the trial, there have been periodic calls from victims' advocacy groups and investigative journalists for further investigations into whether higher-ranking officials should have been held legally accountable. Did the generals who pressured pilots to deliver spectacular shows bear criminal responsibility? Did the politicians who had slashed military safety budgets share the blame? But despite these calls for expanded accountability, no additional charges were ever filed against anyone else. The Ukrainian military conducted internal reforms and issued new safety regulations, mandatory minimum crowd distances of 500 meters, multiple independent safety reviews required before any demonstration, stricter enforcement of altitude minimums for aerobatic maneuvers, but critics argued these were largely cosmetic changes. bureaucratic responses that didn't truly address the deeper cultural problems within military aviation, the emphasis on machismo and bravado, the valorization of risk-taking, the persistent belief that expressing safety concerns is a sign of weakness rather than professionalism. Today, more than 2 decades after the disaster, a solemn memorial stands at the Sknyliv crash site. It's a place of quiet reflection and remembrance, a simple but powerful black marble wall with 85 names engraved, arranged not alphabetically but by age, starting with the youngest victim, 14-month-old baby Sofia, and ending with the oldest, 72-year-old Petro, who died holding his wife's hand. Fresh flowers appear there daily, left by family members who have never stopped mourning, by survivors who carry guilt for living when others died, and by Ukrainian citizens who simply want to remember and honor the dead. Every July 27th, on the anniversary of the disaster, dozens or sometimes hundreds of survivors and victims' families gather at the memorial for a formal remembrance ceremony. They light candles that flicker in the summer breeze. They read the names aloud one by one, so each victim is remembered individually. They share memories of loved ones lost. They cry together. They remember together. The disaster fundamentally changed airshow safety regulations and protocols not just in Ukraine but worldwide. In the immediate aftermath, as news of the catastrophe spread globally and images of the burning wreckage appeared in newspapers and on television around the world, countries across the globe urgently reviewed their existing airshow regulations with fresh eyes and renewed determination. The images from Sknyliv, the scorched earth where families had been picnicking, the twisted metal, the memorial photographs of dead children, served as a horrifying wake-up call about what can happen when safety is treated as optional or when spectacle is prioritized over human life. Minimum crowd distances were increased almost universally across the aviation world. The 500-meter rule became standard in most countries, with many nations implementing even greater distances for particularly high-risk maneuvers. Physical barriers, concrete walls, earth berms, steel fencing, became mandatory in many jurisdictions to ensure that even if an aircraft somehow left the designated flight zone, it would be stopped or at least significantly slowed before reaching spectators. Low-altitude aerobatics were banned outright or severely restricted at most civilian airshows worldwide. The days of pilots performing barrel rolls at 50 feet, of jets screaming past crowds at eye level with afterburners blazing just to give spectators a thrill, of pushing the envelope purely for spectacle, those days largely ended after Sknyliv. Pilots who violate established altitude minimums now face immediate grounding, permanent loss of licenses and potential criminal prosecution. Additional layers of safety review and oversight were mandated before any airshow demonstration could proceed. Independent safety officers not affiliated with or employed by the performing pilots or their organizations must now review and formally approve all flight plans. Technical experts and engineers must calculate minimum safe altitudes based on specific aircraft performance characteristics, current atmospheric conditions and documented pilot experience levels. Multiple officials at different levels must sign off on every maneuver, creating redundancy and multiple checkpoints so that no single person's poor judgment or bad decision can lead to disaster. The Sknyliv disaster took its place in a grim historical list of deadly airshow accidents that have shaped and reshaped aviation safety regulations over the decades. The 1988 Ramstein airshow disaster in Germany, where 3 Italian Air Force jets collided during a formation maneuver and crashed into the crowd, killed 70 people and injured hundreds more. The 2015 Shoreham airshow crash in England, where a vintage Hawker Hunter jet performing aerobatics crashed into traffic on a busy public road adjacent to the airfield, killed 11 people. The 2011 Reno Air Race crash in Nevada, where a highly modified P-51 Mustang lost control at high speed and plowed directly into crowded spectator stands, killed 11 including the pilot. Each of these disasters led to important safety reforms and regulatory changes, but Sknyliv remains the deadliest airshow disaster in recorded aviation history, 85 dead in 3 seconds. A horrific record that no one wants to hold. A benchmark of tragedy that hopefully, with proper safety measures and continued vigilance, will never be exceeded. What makes Sknyliv particularly haunting and uniquely tragic is how utterly completely preventable it was. This wasn't an unforeseeable mechanical failure where a critical component broke without warning. This wasn't unpredictable severe weather that suddenly developed and caught everyone by surprise. This wasn't some bizarre, unforeseeable confluence of improbable events that no one could have anticipated. It was human decision-making, pure and simple. A pilot chose to fly too low because he wanted to impress a crowd and enhance his reputation. Commanders chose not to stop him because they wanted a spectacular show that would generate positive publicity. Organizers chose to position spectators dangerously close to the runway because they wanted to give people a good view and didn't properly consider the consequences. And 85 people, 28 of them children, paid with their lives for those choices, for that collective failure of judgment and responsibility. The question that haunts everyone who studies this disaster deeply, the question that keeps aviation safety investigators awake at night, is simple but profound. Why? Why did Toponar make that choice? What was he thinking in those final moments before he initiated the barrel roll? Did he truly genuinely believe he could execute the maneuver safely at that altitude, or did he know somewhere in his mind that he was taking an unacceptable risk but convinced himself it would probably be fine? Did he think about the spectators at all during his planning, or was he so focused on the flying, on the technical challenge, on proving his skill, that he lost sight of the human stakes? We'll never have complete answers to these questions because Toponar has never spoken publicly about that day, but we can learn from what happened. We can honor the memory of the 85 victims, especially the 28 children who never got to grow up, never got to experience life, by ensuring that airshows never again prioritize spectacle over safety. By demanding rigorous multi-layered oversight and refusing to compromise on safety standards no matter how impressive a proposed maneuver might be. By creating and maintaining a professional culture where pilots not only feel empowered but are actively encouraged and expected to say no to dangerous stunts, where expressing safety concerns is recognized as professionalism rather than weakness or cowardice. By keeping crowds at safe distances behind proper physical barriers. By remembering always that airshows are entertainment, not combat operations, and absolutely no amount of applause or excitement or positive publicity is worth even a single human life. The memorial at Sknyliv bears a simple inscription in Ukrainian. They came to celebrate, they deserved to go home. Those words capture everything about this tragedy. These were innocent people, families, children, elderly couples, who came for a pleasant afternoon of entertainment. They trusted that the professionals running the show would keep them safe. That trust was betrayed in the most catastrophic way possible. July 27, 2002. Sknyliv Airfield, Lviv, Ukraine. A clear summer day. An airshow celebrating Ukrainian military heritage and national pride. And in 3 terrible seconds, 85 lives ended in fire and twisted metal. 85 people went to watch jets fly that day. They brought their families. They packed picnics. They waved flags. They smiled and laughed. They were excited and happy and full of life. They had plans for the evening, for the next day, for the future. None of them deserved to die. Not a single one. We remember them. We must never forget them. We must never forget what happened at Sknyliv. And we must ensure, through unwavering commitment to safety and proper oversight, that such a disaster never ever happens again. That is how we truly honor their memory. That is the only way their deaths can have any meaning at all.